Make sure that we are recording, and we will begin what is a very exciting event for us. So welcome everyone who is entering the room. We're really pleased to see you here. I want to let everyone know that we have a nice time for questions at the end of this event, but of course you can put comments in the chat anytime as we're going along. I'll be able to keep an eye on those as well. So let me begin with a formal welcome. She says the slide is disappearing. Off to a good start. Welcome, everyone. So I'm really pleased to see everyone here today and to be able to introduce and to start this event. I am saying we're all spread out over the country today, but I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm here on the country of the Yugur and Turrbal people this evening, and I want to start by paying my respects to elders past and present, as well as to emerging generations, and to acknowledge that the site that I'm on today, which is the University of Queensland, has always been a place of culture and learning. So I would like to welcome everyone to what is our first event of this kind. This is the Australasian Health and Medical Humanities Network inaugural Work in Progress series. We're really delighted to be able to launch this series, and because it's our first, I thought that I would start by mentioning why we have started this new series. Some of you I know were able to join us for the launch of the network less than a year ago, actually. It launched in June of last year. So it's exciting for us to be able to continue and to augment the more formal public lectures that we will continue to have with something. We thought that it would be really nice to have more of an informal space where we're a new network. The health and medical humanities in Australia is a very new field of work. So we thought that we would take the opportunity to invite some exciting speakers to share some in progress work with us, really with the intention behind this that it would provide a space for discussion, a space for sharing work in progress, and it's really designed to be much more, not a formal sort of presentation, but a space for those of us in this community to talk with one another and to discuss some of the things that we share in common. So that was really what we wanted to do, was to help contribute and develop our community by having different kinds of spaces that are less formal as well. So those of you who are new to this network, or who have maybe heard about us in different ways, not on our own, through our own email listserv with the Health and Medical Humanities Network, before I introduce our fantastic speaker for today, you will see on the welcome slide here that if you have not yet subscribed to updates from the Australasian Health and Medical Humanities Network, you can see on our slide here the link that will take you to the subscription portal, and then you will get emails about other events and activities that are happening around Australia. And if you would like to become a member of the network, you can also see our website there, and there's a contact email address to write to, and we will add you to our members list with great pleasure. So that's my prefacing comments, and now it is my great pleasure to introduce our fantastic speaker for today, Dr. Melissa Dickson. Melissa is a senior lecturer in Victorian literature at the University of Birmingham. She's not speaking to us from Birmingham today because we're the Australasian Health and Medical Humanities Network, and so we like to prioritise local speakers because that's the purpose of our network. So I'm delighted to mention that in addition to her substantive position at the University of Birmingham, we have been very lucky here at the University of Queensland to have Dr. Dickson visiting us for the semester as a visiting fellow here at the University of Queensland. She teaches across the long 19th century and relationships between Victorian literature, science and medicine. So exactly in our area of interest. She's the author of a range of books, including Cultural Encounters with the Arabian Nights in the 19th Century Britain from 2019. She's the co-author of Anxious Times, Medicine and Modernity in the 19th Century, and the co-editor of Progress and Pathology, Medicine and Culture in the 19th Century. So books very central to our interests in this network. Her current work, which is absolutely fascinating, and she's going to speak about today, is looking at explorations of the body's physiological and psychological responses to sound and music in the 19th century. And in fact, the work that she will be sharing with us today comes from that body of work. I've been asked to let you know that this is very in progress work, although it's really good as well. But that's the spirit of our series, is that we are sharing work that isn't finished so that we can respond to each other and have a good conversation about it. Melissa is going to speak for about 25 minutes or so, thereabouts. And then when she's finished, I will pass to my colleague who is here in the room with me, Dr. Karin Sellberg, who will be giving a response and starting a discussion about Melissa's work. But without further ado, I am going to hand over to Melissa to start her paper on tuning in with the stethoscope in the 19th century. And to do that, I am going to stop sharing my screen so that Melissa is able to start sharing hers. And then when she has a chance to bring that up, I will turn over to you, Melissa.
Great. Can you see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a lovely, kind introduction. It's so nice to be in Australia. UQ was my alma mater. I did my undergraduate and master's. So it's so lovely to be home. I was at the launch last year, but I had to get out of bed at 3:30 in the morning to attend. So this feels much more civilized, a time of day to be talking with you all. In the spirit of this being a work in progress, I have put my contact details there, email and Twitter handle. And just to encourage you to please get in touch if you have things that you want to discuss, talk about, feedback. This is very, very rough, despite what Elizabeth says. I'm very open to comments, feedback, further reading and suggestions. But I want to start with this man who I have fallen in love with a little bit over the last couple of years. This is René Laennec, who was a French physician in the early 19th century at the Hôpital Necker in Paris. And the story of the stethoscope, as it's generally told, although it's slightly apocryphal perhaps, begins with him. So the story goes as he himself tells it in his writing. In 1816, he was struggling to diagnose a young woman, an obese young woman who was presenting with symptoms of heart disease in the hospital. The options available to him for assessing or diagnosing this woman posed both social and practical obstacles in the early 19th century. He could use the technique of percussion, which is literally tapping on the body and listening to the sounds that emanate from it. But the patient's weight would make that difficult. The other option available to him, which he didn't feel comfortable taking, was to press his ear against her chest and try to hear the sounds of her heart. This made him uncomfortable for social reasons in 1816. So presented with these problems, he abstracted the situation into a general sort of scientific problem. He recalled the basic principle of acoustics, that sound is louder when it travels through solid objects. He rolled up a cylinder of paper and he put one end against his ear and the other against his patient's chest, and thus invented the first stethoscope. This is a copy that the Wellcome Library in London has of his later attempt at creating the stethoscope. It went through many different variations. As you can see, it doesn't look like that now. I've put throughout my slides different images of stethoscopes from the period just to give you a sense of the kind of range that this object went through in this period. But it was from this point gradually adopted as a method across Europe and America. And it did mark a very important shift in the Western history of listening, whereby the voice of the patient was less important than it was before. You used to tell the doctor how you were feeling, and they listened and diagnosed you. That gave way to listening to the body rather than the voice of the patient. Jonathan Sterne has written that speaking patients with mute bodies gave way to speaking patients with sounding bodies. The stethoscope granted the doctor access to a new auditory realm, a cacophonous realm that required significant study and interpretation in order to understand, but a realm that significantly extended the potentials and the boundaries of medical knowledge. It posited a means of knowing, of understanding and diagnosing the body through the medium of sound. Jonathan Sterne and Stanley Joel Reiser have offered very detailed accounts of the significance of this as a mode of listening in everyday medicine, one that transformed methods of diagnosis and that was also extended into media contexts such as sound reproduction technologies. My interest in this, which as Elizabeth has said, is part of a larger project on sensory thresholds and the kind of shifting limits of audibility in this time period, lies with the social, with the cultural and psychological ramifications of this. For the patient, the increasingly objectified patient who is now acutely aware of but unable to access or to understand the sounds of their own body. The stethoscope emerged within very specific social and cultural parameters, and it was a response to a social problem as much as it was to a technical one in performing diagnosis. Undoubtedly, it served in the maintenance of gendered expectations. Laennec wrote in his 900-page treatise that it was inadvisable to apply one's ear to the chest of a female patient. And this was replicated and lauded in medical journals that you no longer had to do this. There were also matters of hygiene. These 8 inches between doctor and patient were also celebrated by doctors. In fact, in the 1850s, a doctor named William Leonard designed an unusually long stethoscope just to get a bit more space from the patient to help in listening to the chest of particularly unclean individuals. So there's a lot of social factors and cultural factors, political factors that are circulating around this object in this moment as well. It's not just a new way of conducting medical diagnosis, but it's a visible material conduit between doctor and patient that literally and figuratively distances the doctor from the patient, that renegotiates the hierarchies of doctor-patient relations, and that gives the doctor access to knowledge, specialized knowledge beyond the limits of average sensory perception. And as medical institutions accepted this new technology and became increasingly professionalized and specialized throughout the century, the stethoscope became a kind of focal point for many patients as a kind of palpable interface between doctor and patient, but also one between hope and fear, between health and unhealth, between the visible and the invisible. And a lot of fictions from this period speculate on the nature of that interface, sometimes quite quickly in passing, sometimes at length, ranging in genre from the more subtle philosophical reflections of George Eliot, as Mr. Lydgate wields his stethoscope in George Eliot's Middlemarch, to Van Helsing's attempts to ward off evil with his modern medicine in Bram Stoker's Dracula. I've been really surprised to find how frequently stethoscopes appear in 19th century fiction when you start looking for them. And I think this is testament in itself to the increasing prominence of this instrument in general society, in the cultural imagination as well. One of the key ways in which they appear is as complaint. Fictional patients often complain about being subjected to stethoscopic examination about the sense of intrusion, about the exhaustion that this examination induces in them. Just a few quick examples. The narrator of Anthony Trollope's The Three Clerks elicits sympathy for his heroine, Katie Woodward, by observing that the poor girl lived beneath a stethoscope and bore all their pokings and tappings with exquisite patience. In Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lucius Daverin, Homer Sivwright invites his physician to visit, but he adds, "I suppose there will be no necessity for any more serious examinations like this morning's," with a faint smile and a disagreeable recollection of the stethoscope. Later, Braddon's nervous Mrs. Winstanley also complains that the London doctor tired me dreadfully with his stethoscope. Because the stethoscope is such a large instrument and it's not flexible at all, you have to move the patient, you don't move the instrument. So there's a lot of rearranging of bodies around the instrument, which is the cause, I think, of this discomfort and tiredness on the part of the patient. Complaints were so widespread about having to undergo this kind of exam when you were already ill and fatigued. The English physician John Forbes actually attributed the increase in mesmeric practice to the increase in use of the stethoscope, that patients would rather go to a clairvoyant than have a stethoscopic examination. He says, in mesmerism, no doctor intrudes with his troublesome and disagreeable questions. No pulse need be felt, no tongue need be shown, no horrid percussor or more horrid stethoscope need frighten the gentle breast from its propriety. Mesmerism here represents detachment and calm and distance, and it stands in stark contrast to the physicality and the disruption of the stethoscope and the physical examination. The image on the slide is from a book that I've been reading at the moment on a practical guide to mesmerism, and it features these kinds of illustrations that I think really emphasize that sense of calm and distance, as opposed to the stethoscope. And these particular pictures are of consumption and tuberculosis, which I think is particularly interesting, as they were the two diseases that were able to be diagnosed more quickly thanks to the stethoscope. And they're being connected here to mesmeric treatment instead. There's a kind of sense that the mesmerist can negotiate this threshold in more abstract and more subtle ways than any kind of crude instrument like the stethoscope. Nonetheless, the stethoscope was increasingly, and still is, I think, the symbol of modern medical practice, such that as early as 1842, the editors of Punch advised its readers that the London medical student, in order to keep up his character, ought perpetually to carry a stethoscope. One must be seen with it to be a legitimate doctor. There were reports of doctors who were hard of hearing who took stethoscopes about with them as well, just to give their patients a sense of confidence in their medical skills. Punch goes on to note, it's a curious instrument used for the purpose of hearing what people are thinking about, or something of the kind. There's kind of hints here of a sort of vaguely supernatural presence or some kind of agency in the instrument itself. And then it goes on to observe when medicine arrives at such a pitch that the secret of the human heart can be probed, it need not go any further and will have power of doing mischief enough. This is Punch, so it's obviously lighthearted, but I think that there is a notion here that there is a possibility that the stethoscope, and by extension the physician, can hear one's thoughts, can access one's secret feelings, things one hasn't spoken to anyone. And there's a kind of conflation between the material and the metaphoric action of the heart here, that the body is somehow vulnerable to this scientific instrument transmitting its innermost sounds, but also its innermost thoughts and feelings. This is a common association with the stethoscope in this moment, this kind of method of prying that's not necessarily medical, but can move into these sorts of personal affairs of the heart, and indeed of the psyche. It's in this kind of vein that Thackeray uses the stethoscope as a metaphor in his novel, The Virginians. The narrator asks, shall we play eavesdropper at twilight embrasures, count sighs and handshakes, bottle hot tears, lay our stethoscope upon delicate young breasts and hear their heart throbs. Again, this kind of alignment of the medical practice of listening to the heart with this kind of more ignoble practice of eavesdropping. Whatever its limitations in medical consultation, and there were absolutely many, particularly in the monaural stethoscope, the reverberation in the tube and the challenges of trying to hear anything. In the popular imagination and culturally, it's bestowed with extraordinary powers of penetration and access. Blackwood's magazine observes in 1847 that this is an object that has long ceased to excite merely professional interest, for there are few families to whom it has not proved an object of horror and the saddest remembrance. Reflecting on its status as an instrument on which the hopes and fears, one may also say the destinies of mankind hang, the writer notes that it appears to present a fit subject for poetic treatment. And to prove this claim, it subjects it to poetic treatment and follows this rumination with a very long poem. It's about 10 pages, called To the Stethoscope, which directly addresses the object itself. I find it interesting that the focus shifts quickly from the physician to the object, to the stethoscope. I put the first stanza on the slide. It's very long. It's quite awful in places, but the stethoscope's referred to as a musician's trumpet, which has kind of heraldic overtones. It's referred to as a king's scepter, a prophet's source of vision, a priest's sacrificial altar. Throughout the poem, it is the object that is all-knowing, it's all-powerful, and it's utterly indifferent to human desire or will. And it seems from the perspective of the patient that it is the stethoscope rather than the doctor that makes this kind of declaration of health or illness, and it kind of whispers its secrets into the ears of the physician. It says, stethoscope, thou simple tube, clarion of the yawning tomb, unto me thou seemst to be a very trump of doom. Wielding thee, the grave physician by the trembling patient stands, like some deftly skilled musician, strange the trumpet in his hands, whilst the sufferer's eyeball glistens, full of hope and full of fear. Quickly he bends and listens with his quick accustomed ear, waiteth until thou shalt tell tidings of the war within. In the battle and the strife, is it death or is it life that the fought for prize shall win? And quite early on, we have this kind of metaphor as illness as a kind of war, a metaphor that has carried on into contemporary culture. And I think the poem is really playing on this idea of a war being fought inside the body that the individual isn't actually privy to, and that the stethoscope operates as a kind of interface on that threshold between life and death. Part of this, of course, is that diagnosis is improving faster than cure and treatment. So often a doctor can tell you you have a disease, but can't actually offer a treatment or cure for it at this stage. So it is a trump of impending doom in a lot of ways in this time period. And a lot of doctors are eager to establish their authority by employing the stethoscope as an instrument of science. But I think this kind of poem makes clear that actually, from the patient's perspective, it's a rather more anxious process that's imbued with wonder and with magic and with the unknown, rather than anything concretely scientific from that perspective. Given that these kinds of sensations of horror and dread and insight into the unknown are staples of the Victorian Gothic and of sensation fiction, it's perhaps not surprising that medical facts and cultural anxieties surrounding the use of the stethoscope provide this kind of anxious site for the medical and the imaginative to disrupt and inform one another in fictional explorations of the power of the stethoscope. One of my favorite examples of this is the opening scenes of Sheridan Le Fanu's Gothic novel, Uncle Silas. The young Maud interrupts her father and a strange man named Mr. Brierly in his study, where they're surrounded by strange instruments and seem to be too intent on other matters to hear her enter. She says, my father was sitting in his chair with his coat and waistcoat off, Mr. Brierly kneeling on a stool beside him, rather facing him, his black scratch wig leaning close to my father's grizzled hair. There was a large tome of their divinity lore, I suppose, upon the table close by. The lank black figure of Mr. Brierly stood up, and he concealed something quickly in the breast of his coat. And as her father kind of brusquely orders Maud from the room, it's clear to the reader, at least, that he's anxious his daughter has interrupted his medical examination and has learned the truth of his declining health. Mr. Brierly is a doctor. He's been leaning forward on his knees, listening to his patient's chest, and he's concealing a stethoscope from view as Maud enters the room. Maud, however, is so frightened and confused by what she's seen that she believes her father is engaged in occult worship. And she conflates the figure of the physician with this enigmatical lank high priest, that metaphor that was in the Blackwood's poem, the doctor aligning with the priest. Though erroneous, it does kind of replicate the sort of inescapable hierarchy of the doctor-patient relation. Maud's father is not confessing his sins to a priest, but his body is revealing its inner truths to a skilled physician. There is a kind of intimate exchange of information, inaudible to the naked ear, taking place here. Austen is looking to his physician for guidance and for insight over matters of life and death. And it is as awe-inspiring and potentially haunting as that inspired by religious institutions or by the occult. And this is part of the new status that the physician holds by the end of the 19th century. At the start of the century, they're very much on the footing of a household servant. By the end of the century, they're very much skilled professionals that command attention in new ways. It's far from unusual for new technologies to be described as magical or wonderful by their first users. But I think the association of the stethoscope with magic marks this kind of deep cultural fascination with that potentially distressing, intimate knowledge of one's own body that lies beyond the limits of ordinary auditory perception. This is an instrument of ordeal. As the narrator of Braddon's All Along the River observes, it thrills us all with the aching pain of fear when we see it in the doctor's hand. It's an instrument that provokes distress, as in Le Fanu's 1873 novel, 1897, sorry, Willing to Die. There were hushed, dreadful moments while he listened thoughtfully through his stethoscope to the still small voice of fate, to us inaudible, pronouncing on the dread issues of life or death. There are many examples like this of Gothic stethoscopes in the period that really, I think, expand upon and offer a different perspective to medical history. And the very few examples I've shown you here, I think, do illustrate the ways in which the stethoscope is seen to offer a kind of mystical communication between doctor and patient. They're responses that interweave traditions of magic, science, and religion in order to inculcate a sense of mystery and power in the subject. There's a kind of delicate balance here, I think, between science and mystery, or science and magic, in this kind of apparent ability to foretell the future and the hitherto unknown, that really captures, I think, that sense of pushing at the boundaries of knowledge and of science in this time period. It is equally important, I think, to recognize the ways in which the medical profession and its practice are drawn upon and reflected upon in the world of literature. And we see this more in realist fiction of the period. And so to end, as I quickly look at my watch, I'll be 2 minutes. I want to turn by way of illustration to George Eliot's Middlemarch, which is a novel, I think, that explicitly addresses different modes of listening in medical, but also in social contexts. There is much pain that is quite noiseless, declares the narrator of Felix Holt. And the vibrations that make human agonies are often a mere whisper in the roar of hurrying existence. And it's these unuttered cries and sufferings committed to no sound except that of low moans in the night, to which Eliot dedicates so much of her work. It is extremely auditory in nature. Her fiction is filled with unheard, misheard heartbeats and palpitations, as her characters demonstrate varying levels of deafness to the pulse of other individuals, to existence in general, that famous roar on the other side of silence. And it's in Middlemarch in particular, I think, that a kind of idealized stethoscopic listening is brought to the fore. And it's brought to the fore very deliberately in the character of Tertius Lydgate, a young surgeon fresh from Paris, references Laennec, he studied with him, and he's brought his stethoscope to Middlemarch, wanting to do good for the town, for the world, and he's passionate about medical reform. It's George Eliot, so it really doesn't go according to plan. But throughout the novel, Lydgate employs his stethoscope and he listens to the beats and pulses of others. He hears their voices and their bodies, and he's alert to pathological conditions. This is not the case in terms of his romantic entanglements, but in terms of his medical practice. He is associated with the word attention. Attentive or attention are words continually attached to Lydgate throughout this novel. And we see, I think, how the medical merges with the metaphorical and the philosophical to inform a kind of outlook on life and a way of being and knowing. When Dorothea's husband, Casaubon, has an attack, Lydgate, we're told, seemed to think the case worth a great deal of attention. He uses his stethoscope, but he also sits by his patient and watches him before he delivers a very precise diagnosis for this period of fatty degeneration of the heart. This is an extremely up-to-date medical reference. And Dorothea has this kind of implicit faith in this young medic and the soundings of his stethoscope. She wants him to proclaim her future, as we have seen in these poems already. The stethoscope is given this power. Lydgate, however, is as attentive to her psychological life as he's been to Casaubon's pathology, and he finds himself deeply touched by her situation, made manifest through her imploring tone, through words that come out like a cry in her silences. He has this kind of sympathetic attention to the sounds emanating from Dorothea in a very profound moment of non-verbal exchange, which is presented in this passage as a kind of acoustic cry from soul to soul that identifies them as kindred natures in the same embroiled medium. The very foundation of the doctor-patient relationship, this narrator tells us, is the perpetual claim made on the doctor to the immediate fresh application of thought and on the consideration of another's need and trial. It is for this reason, Eliot observes, that many of us looking back through life would say that the kindest man we have ever known has been a medical man, perhaps that surgeon whose fine tact, directed by deeply informed perception, has come to us in our need with a more sublime beneficence than that of miracle workers. This is a very idealized medical professional, one who is alert, tactful, kind, has a keen degree of perception, derived from the use of the senses, but also the imagination and the exercise of critical judgment. And it bears a striking resemblance, I think, to Eliot's more general notion of sympathy and imagination. For Eliot, only a sympathetic disposition and a sense of openness enable the individual to recognize the limitations of subjective experience and imaginatively to enter the perspective of others. This receptive temperament and oral discernment demonstrated by Lydgate thus provide a kind of model for this sympathy and for broader social relationships that are understood as a mode of listening, in which only those who pay attention to the sounds which others have been unable to detect are granted access to that kind of fellowship we see established momentarily between Lydgate and Dorothea. But like those patients that are unable to hear the sounds of their own bodies, transmitted to the physicians who possess the appropriate instruments to detect them, the vast majority of Middlemarchers remain insensitive to the elements of tragedy that surround them. Attentive stethoscopic listening ultimately provides a means of discrimination, of knowing and orienting oneself, of relating to others amidst the great din of the modern world. And I shall pause there and see what Karin has to say.
Okay, let me start by unmuting myself so that I don't get a bunch of messages saying you're on mute, which would be ironic given that we have just been speaking about sound. So, and for sound-related reasons, Karin, who is about to give her response, is going to speak from my computer. So we are going to, because you can't have two microphones on in the same place. So just a couple of prefacing comments before we do that. I am restraining myself from making comments straight away after Melissa's fantastic talk. Thank you so much for that. I really learned a lot from that. For those of us who focus on visual cultures, it's really nice to hear something about sound. So let me move now. I'm just going to give you remind you how the rest of the session will go. So I'm going to turn to my colleague, Dr. Karin Sellberg now. She is going to give a response. I just wanted to say, while she's doing that, those of you, despite how polished Melissa's presentation was, I know this is a work in progress for Melissa. She's working on this book at the moment. So, it would be nice if you had, ideas and references and thoughts and comments to share. If you put those in the Q&A button that you can see at the bottom of Zoom, we'll monitor those together. Karin is going to steer the discussion session, but between us, we'll keep an eye on both the screen and the Q&A. So that's just a little bit of housekeeping from me. So now let me turn to my colleague, Dr. Karin Sellberg, who is going to give a response. Many of you will know Karin's work. She is a member of our steering committee in the Australasian Health and Medical Humanities Network. You might have seen her present at some of our other events, like the launch event last year. And many of you will know her work. She's written voluminously in the area of the medical humanities over a very long period of time now, probably one of the earlier people working in this field. So without further ado, let me turn now. I'm going to, for reasons of microphone and sound and no feedback, I'm going to roll backwards, and Karin is going to take the position in the middle here.
Oh, and I think I'm going to get a weird kind of two-image picture as well, which will be very interesting. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Melissa, for an amazing paper. I feel very honored to have the opportunity to respond to such a thought-provoking and inspiring piece. So I'm not planning to introduce any new ideas here. I think Melissa has given us a very rich plethora of topics for discussion, but rather I'm going to hone in on a couple of the notions you touched on. Starting off with the discussion right at the beginning of the paper of the increasingly objectified patient. And the growing distance between doctor and patient, and the introduction of the intermediary stethoscope. Having worked primarily on the medical history of the 17th and 18th centuries, so the period preceding the introduction of the stethoscope, I found this discussion really fascinating, especially as in the examples you were giving, the actual doctor-patient encounter seemed to be more mysterious or even mystical, as you put it, but also intensely intimate. The secrecy or lack of understanding of the instrument's inner workings created a knowledge gap between doctor and patient, yes, but it also seemed to create a shared physical understanding or more intimate knowledge of their condition, represented as a form of attentiveness, as you put it. I was particularly struck by that scene from was it from Fanu with the doctor leaning over the father. I mean, it sounded a bit like a sort of secret kind of encounter. And I was fascinated by the sensual politics of this process. So I've spent quite a bit of time working on William Harvey's famous treatise on the circulation of the blood, where the sensuality of examination is hailed as one of the most important assets of a truly skilled physician. Arguing in favor of dissection and experimentation in medical education, Harvey writes that physicians who are, and I quote, inexperienced and ignorant of anatomy and making no appeal to the senses are entirely unprepared for the actual encounter with people's bodies in a clinical setting. So Harvey compares the to Odysseus' encounter with Charybdis on the waves of the Sicilian Sea, where they are dashed against rocks, waves, hissing and foaming. And the only thing that gets them through is the awareness of the sounds and the feeling of the ocean. So like Melissa's fictional physicians, Harvey does, of course, also have a special interest in the heart. But it should be noted that his treatises feature very few actual encounters with real living bodies. Most of the examples he gives are actual kind of from dissections. But all the same, I was struck when you were speaking about the sensual language surrounding stethoscopic examination, of similarities in the appeal to a multisensory approach. Harvey's treatise continually makes references to the sound and feel of the pulse. And in a couple of places, even the smell of a person suffering from a weak heart, or what he terms a corruption of the blood. So my question to you is there maybe something about this field of study, so the study of the heart, that invites a multisensory viewpoint, even before the introduction of this instrument? And is it maybe the limited perceptibility of these functions that makes these endeavors possible? Maybe we need other senses because we can't really see it. Mm. So that's my first question, and that was quite long. But I have one more question that's a little bit shorter. So again, Melissa, I loved your discussion towards the end of the paper of the ideal medical professional as someone who's, and I quote you here, alert, tactful, kind, and with a keen degree of perception derived from the use of the senses, the imagination, and the exercise of critical judgment. It immediately perked my closet Foucauldian interest, reminding me of his discussion of the coup d'oeil, or medical gaze, in The Birth of the Clinic. And it struck me what a good example your study provides of the tensions imbued in this term. The increasing emphasis on perception that Foucault describes in French 18th century medical history, alongside this increasingly mysticized multisensory experience that actually takes place in the clinical encounter. I mean, it truly becomes channeled in the instrument or object of the stethoscope. And I thought I'd ask you, and I guess the rest of the audience as well, if you could unpack this a little bit further and maybe consider to what extent the stethoscope comes to stand in for or symbolize a tension between seeing and other sensual input that was there in the understanding of the clinical encounter already, and was maybe kind of in flux at this time as well. So that's all for me. Thank you so much. So Melissa, do you want to maybe respond to that?
I will do my best. They were big and thought-provoking questions. Thank you so much for that. That's a wonderful response. I've just jotted down some things as you were talking. Yes, I absolutely, I think your pressing of that as strangely distancing and strangely intimate is exactly right. That sort of discomfort between being physically rearranged and sort of handled and, you know, touched, and, you know, the kind of embarrassment of that, the sense of intimacy of that, at the same time as being really remote from the purpose of it, the knowledge that's being gained, and inability to hear what's happening, even if you can, to interpret it and know what it signifies, is impossible without training. And that tension is absolutely there. Freud, of course, later uses the stethoscope as a phallic symbol. That's sort of the doctor pushing the instrument against patients, and identifies that as a kind of sexual tension as well. So those kinds of movements are definitely there, absolutely. And that kind of knowledge gap. I'm going to read William Harvey. I've written that down. But yes, the multisensory appeal as well. I mean, the stethoscope comes from the Greek for chest explorer. It's impossible not to think of it as a kind of telescope in some ways, a way of looking into the chest, but sort of synesthetically through the ear. And that kind of language is there as well. One of my doctors from my time period gives this lecture about within this space we cannot see. We must, listen, we must smell, we must tap, and we must imagine. And I think there's something about it that provokes that engagement of all the senses in an attempt to kind of access what's happening, particularly in England. In France, autopsies were legal, and you could actually see at some point, you could conduct an autopsy and see what had happened and what had occurred to create the sounds that you could hear before. In the early decades in England, that was illegal. So it was very difficult to connect what you were hearing with what was actually happening without that visual correlation afterwards. But I think absolutely the stethoscope is that kind of stand-in for, what have I written? Multi-sensory engagement, absolutely. And Foucault does talk about that kind of triangulation of the haptic, the visual and the oral in that moment of modern clinical medicine, and I think the stethoscope does very much capture that process. I'll stop talking now because I think other people might have interesting things to say.
Indeed. Thank you for that fantastic response, Karin, and for your response to Karin's question, Melissa. So I am going to invite anyone now who would like to ask a question or to join the conversation to put their question into, you will see there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you use that there, I will just keep an eye on the questions there, and I'm just going to open that up so I can see. So I'll invite you to write your questions in there. So while people are gathering their thoughts, Melissa, and having a chance to type, one of the things that I get to ask my question now, one of the things that I really wanted to, that really struck me during your presentation and that I wanted to ask about, I loved, the comments that you were making about the fact that prior to the stethoscope, the focus had been on the speaking patient, so that the patient would tell the doctor what they were feeling, or, what their symptoms were, or what was going on with them. And then with the rise of the stethoscope and we see a whole wave of instrumentation like that over that period, then suddenly you have this kind of passive body that is listened to by the doctor and doesn't need to speak anymore. That reversal of the sound and who gets to speak, I thought was really interesting. What I was wondering when you were talking is there, over this period, have you found discussions amongst the, in the medical literature or amongst the early users of the stethoscope where they talk about the sound as a diagnostic category? If you hear this, it might mean this. If you hear this, that means that the patient's normal. The heart, you should hear this in terms of the heart. Is there a discussion about sound in terms of diagnostic categories that happens there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really long process. From that story at the start in 1816, where he first rolled up the paper, it was 3.5 years later that he published a 900-page treatise on the art of stethoscopy, during which time he had been trying to listen to patients, conduct autopsies, and correlate what he'd heard with what he then saw. And then tried to find a way to capture and communicate that to others. He has some wonderful poetic descriptions, of various conditions of the lungs and the heart. That's, some of them are, it sounds like a cat purring by the fire on a winter's evening, or the creak of a freshly oiled saddle, and things like that. It's very subjective, and that's part of the difficulty. And he tried to notate it. He was a musician. He had a very good ear. He played the flute, and he could hear sounds that other people did. I've listened through that stethoscope in the Science Museum and I couldn't hear a damn thing, but the reverberation in the tube. So sort of training your ear for what you're actually supposed to be listening to and then understanding it was a very long process. And a lot of doctors would say you just have to learn by doing it. You just have to listen to lots of chests and then you'll work it out eventually. And some people tried to represent it in graphs or represent it in words, but it was a lot of discussion and a long process. And Karin, I'm not sure if I've already told you this, but one of my doctors set the pulse to music as well, as a minuet. So there was that kind of attempt as well to represent it in a musical form, or you know, an auditory structure that was already there. But it was quite a long time before there was a sense of consensus about what you were hearing and what it meant and how you learn it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melissa. I have a question here from Claire Nicholson. Thanks, Claire. So Claire's question is, and this is an interesting one, at what stage did the stethoscope start to be used for abdominal sounds?
Surprisingly early, 40s and 50s. 1840s and 50s. I've got accounts of stones, gallstones, kidney stones, and fetal heartbeats being detected through the stethoscope. There's a poem by George Moore, the Irish poet, called From a Stethoscope to an Unborn Child. And the whole poem is a discussion between, not the doctor, the stethoscope, and the child, significantly not the mother, to go back to Elizabeth's point about the silence of the voice of the person whose body is now sounding instead of them. So it's definitely taking place quite early. And it comes up in discussions where previously women could conceal pregnancies much more easily. But when the doctor had a stethoscope and could hear a fetal heartbeat, then it was more readily available knowledge to the medical institution as well. So that kind of issue did crop up in documentation quite early.
Oh yes, that's really interesting because of course there's a lot of controversy around whether something and the circumstances in which something is being identified as a pregnancy and so on. But yeah, that's a really interesting point. Thanks, Melissa. So everyone, I'm pretty close to our time here. I'm calling last questions, but we've had a good one come in here. Thanks, Gillian. So Gillian says that she's interested, Melissa, in your remark that even doctors who had hearing impairments would still wear a stethoscope to show their medical expertise. Yeah, that's really funny. The stethoscope has long been a status symbol. Gillian says she remembers a few years ago there was an uproar on Twitter about a doctor criticising a picture of a nurse wearing a stethoscope, claiming it was encroaching on the medical domain. There was an enormous pushback from nurses and more enlightened doctors to claim the stethoscope was a useful tool, not a status symbol. Do you, Melissa, have any thoughts about the social prestige of the stethoscope in your period of study? Great question. Thank you.
It's really interesting. I gave a talk about the stethoscope to a medical school in Birmingham at the end of last year, and they all said to me, I don't know how applicable it is, but they all said you don't actually need a stethoscope anymore, but we all just wear it because we feel like we've earned the right to wear it now that we're young junior doctors, which I thought was very interesting, this sort of association with status. By the 1890s, that's definitely creeping in. Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame, who was trained as a doctor, wrote a series of short stories called Round the Red Lamp. And in two of them, it features a deaf doctor who still carries his stethoscope around and pretends to use it because people don't trust him if he hasn't got a stethoscope. So it definitely has that association, perhaps not social prestige so much as that association with medical authority. There's complaints. Patients will say, you haven't used a stethoscope on me. You don't know what you're talking about. Why aren't you doing this, using the stethoscope? And that sort of 1880s, 1890s has that association that to be a real doctor, to parallel your example with the nurses, you should be carrying one and using it.
excellent example, Gillian. I'm shaking my head over the uppity nurses with their stethoscopes, and Gillian saying thanks for your answer as well. Everyone, we're actually pretty much out of time. And so last call, if you type quickly, you can get in there. But I'm going to suggest that Melissa would probably continue to welcome your feedback as her book with this material in it is still in train. And of course, you can contact Melissa through our website, or, you know, Google still works as well. You have her details. So I am going to say thank you so much to Melissa Dickson for a really fantastic first work in progress session. This really got our series off to a fantastic start, and it provides a really nice space for people to share their work in a more informal and collegial context. And of course, thank you so much, Dr. Karin Sellberg, as well, for a really thought-provoking response that helped us have a nice conversation about that afterwards. So thank you again, everyone. Lovely to see you. And we will let you know when the next work in progress session is happening. The recording of this seminar will be posted in due course on our website, so anyone who hasn't been able to see it live has a chance to catch up on that then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Oh, you're welcome.